Wait, there was a time when Huawei looked almost unstoppable. Its phones were everywhere. The cameras were getting better, the hardware was getting more ambitious, and Huawei was closing the gap with Samsung and Apple faster than almost anyone expected. Then, almost overnight, the rules changed. Huawei didn't just lose customers, it lost access to some of the technology that helped make its phones competitive around the world. So how did one of the biggest smartphone companies on the planet fall so far? To understand that, we have to go back before the downfall. Welcome back to Tech Mystery Documentary. Today we're talking about the downfall of Huawei and what really went wrong. For years, Huawei had been quietly building itself into a smartphone giant. It wasn't always taken seriously. But instead of trying to copy Apple or Samsung perfectly, Huawei started attacking the market from different angles. Its phones offered powerful hardware, increasingly impressive cameras, huge batteries, fast charging, and flagship features at prices that were often difficult for competitors to ignore. And Huawei wasn't just growing in China. It was making serious progress in Europe and other international markets. By 2019, Huawei had become the world's second-largest smartphone maker. Then came the moment that changed everything. In May 2019, the United States placed Huawei on its Entity List, restricting American companies from supplying the company with technology without government approval. And one of the biggest consequences was Google. For Huawei, Android itself wasn't necessarily the problem. The bigger problem was everything built around it. Google Play, Google Maps, Gmail, YouTube, and the other Google mobile services that many international Android users simply expect to have on their phones. Huawei's new devices could no longer receive Google's services in the normal way, and that created a huge problem outside China. Because in China, Google services were already largely unavailable. But in Europe and many other international markets, they were part of the everyday smartphone experience. Imagine buying an expensive flagship phone, and then discovering that the apps you've used for years aren't officially there. That changed the value proposition completely. And Huawei knew it. So instead of disappearing, the company started building its own answer. Its own software ecosystem, its own app store, its own operating system strategy. But software wasn't the only problem. There was something even more serious coming. Chips. But chips were a much bigger problem than apps. Huawei had invested heavily in designing its own smartphone processors through HiSilicon, the company behind its Kirin chips. That gave Huawei something most phone manufacturers didn't have, a powerful level of control over its hardware. But designing a chip and actually manufacturing one are two very different things. Huawei depended on advanced semiconductor manufacturing, and those factories relied on technology and equipment connected to the United States. In May 2020, the US tightened its export rules specifically to restrict Huawei's ability to obtain semiconductors produced using certain American technology. A few months later, those restrictions were tightened again, and suddenly Huawei couldn't simply order the latest chips and keep producing phones at the same scale. This was devastating because smartphones aren't just glass, cameras, and batteries, they're supply chains. Take away one critical component, and the entire product can become impossible to manufacture. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Huawei had actually reached the top of the global smartphone market in the second quarter of 2020, briefly overtaking Samsung in shipments. But there's an important detail behind that headline. More than 70% of those shipments came from China, where Huawei remained extremely strong. Outside China, the situation was becoming much harder. Without Google's services on newer devices, Huawei was losing one of the biggest reasons international customers chose Android phones in the first place. And without reliable access to advanced chips, Huawei couldn't simply keep releasing flagship phones at the same pace. Then came another major decision. Huawei eventually sold Honor, its former smartphone sub-brand, in late 2020. The goal was to allow Honor to operate independently and regain access to suppliers that were restricted from doing business with Huawei. Meanwhile, Huawei started rebuilding from the ground up. It pushed its own app gallery store. It expanded Huawei mobile services and it developed HarmonyOS as an alternative software ecosystem. But there was a problem. Building an operating system isn't enough. You need developers, you need apps, you need users, and most importantly, you need people outside your home market to believe that switching away from Android or iOS is worth it. That is where Huawei's global smartphone comeback became extremely difficult. The company still had excellent hardware. Its cameras were competitive, its engineering was still impressive, but the smartphone market isn't won by hardware alone. It's an ecosystem. And Huawei had suddenly been forced to build a new one while competing against two ecosystems that were already deeply established. So was Huawei actually finished? Not quite, because the company had one more card to play. And this time, it wasn't just about smartphones, but smartphones weren't the only place Huawei was going. The company had already become much bigger than phones. Huawei was investing in cloud computing, networking, digital power, automotive technology, and artificial intelligence. And that diversification became extremely important, because while the global smartphone business had been damaged, Huawei was building other parts of the company that didn't depend on winning the international phone market. Then came a surprising development. Huawei began showing that it could still produce high-end phones with its own chips. That didn't mean the sanctions had disappeared, it meant Huawei had adapted to them. The company was becoming more vertically integrated, relying more heavily on its own technology and domestic suppliers. And HarmonyOS was becoming more than just a backup plan. Huawei eventually moved toward a version of HarmonyOS designed to stand on its own, rather than simply depending on compatibility with Android. So today, the Huawei story is much more complicated than simply saying, Huawei failed. The company absolutely lost something enormous. Its global smartphone business was severely weakened. Its access to Google's ecosystem disappeared from newer phones. Its chip supply became far more difficult. And its international smartphone presence never returned to what it was before the restrictions. But Huawei itself didn't disappear. In fact, its revenue recovered strongly in the years that followed, and the company continued expanding in areas like AI, cloud, and other technology businesses. That's what makes Huawei's story so interesting. The downfall was real, but so was the comeback. Huawei didn't simply return to the company it was before 2019. It became something different, more focused on China, more dependent on its own ecosystem, and far more determined to control the technology underneath its products. So what really went wrong? Huawei's biggest problem wasn't that it suddenly forgot how to make good phones, it was that the world around its phones changed. The software it depended on was restricted. The chips it needed became harder to manufacture, and the global ecosystem that had helped Huawei grow was suddenly no longer available in the same way. For a company built around global technology supply chains, that was a devastating blow. But perhaps the biggest lesson is this. In the smartphone industry, great hardware isn't enough. You need software, you need chips, you need suppliers, you need developers, you need customers, and you need access to the global technology ecosystem. Huawei had almost all of those things, until it didn't. And that is how one of the world's fastest growing smartphone companies went from chasing Apple and Samsung to rebuilding its entire technology stack from the ground up. This has been Tech Mystery Documentary. Thanks for watching.